Bikers ripped an old veteran's shirt. The Delta Force tattoo stunned the whole bar. The peaceful routine of the Rusty Spoke was shattered by the roar of engines and the arrogant arrival of the notorious Rust Motorcycle Club. Their leader, a brute named Savage, sauntered in, sizing up the room and settling his predatory gaze on the quietest man in the place. Jim, a humble, gray-haired bartender. "You think you're something special?" Savage sneered, his hands resting on the bar as his gang spread out like a pack of wolves. Jim simply wiped a glass, his body language screaming, ordinary and unassuming. But in just a few moments, after a moment of public humiliation, Savage would see a tattoo that would not only silence the entire bar, but force him to his knees, begging for forgiveness. Before we dive in, if you like this kind of stories of overcoming adversity and justice, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. An old soldier's quiet life was shattered by a pack of wolves. What they didn't know was the sheepdog they targeted had never truly left the fight. The Rusty Spoke was a quiet place. Nestled just off Route 19, it was a low-slung, cedar-paneled bar with a wraparound porch and a sign that had lost half its lettering to a decade of sun and wind. Inside, the air was a thick, comfortable mix of stale beer, sawdust, and the faint, sweet smell of cherry pipe tobacco from old Mr. Henderson in the corner. For most of the week, the loudest sound was the clatter of pool balls or the soft chime of the cash register. It was a place where people knew your name and your coffee order. A sanctuary. But sanctuaries, like all good things, are built to be tested. That test arrived with a low, guttural rumble that grew into a roar. It wasn't a single motorcycle, but a wave of them, a rolling thunder that shook the windows and rattled the glasses behind the bar. 6 bikes in total, all custom choppers with blacked-out engines and chrome that reflected the evening sun like a warning. They kicked up a cloud of ochre dust as they pulled into the lot, surrounding a tired-looking Toyota Tundra and a couple of beat-up sedans. The men dismounted, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Local legend called them the Rust, a nomadic motorcycle club that moved from town to town, leaving a trail of broken windows, empty cash registers, and nervous smiles. They were a pack of circling sharks, preying on small-town innocence and the good nature of folks who just wanted to be left alone. Mr. Henderson, a man of 64 with kind eyes and a lifetime of hard work on his hands, lowered his pipe and said, "Bad news is coming," his voice a low, gravelly whisper. The bar's usual chatter died down, replaced by a nervous, expectant silence. Every eye in the place was on the front door, a heavy oak slab with a simple brass handle. A tall man in a leather vest with a patch that read Sergeant at Arms pushed it open just enough to peer inside, his eyes a cold, assessing blue. His shoulders were wide, his arms thick with muscle, and a long scar snaked from his ear down his neck. The rest of the gang, burly men in denim jackets and faded jeans, stood behind him, waiting for the signal. The air grew thick with a tension you could almost taste, like the static before a lightning strike. The silence stretched, and then the man in the vest nodded to his crew. The door creaked open further, and the first of the riders stepped into the warm light of the bar. All eyes were drawn to the leader, the biggest of them all. His shadow stretched long across the floor, and the hum of conversation was completely gone. Now there was only the sound of heavy boots on the worn floorboards. The peaceful sanctuary was about to have its quiet tested. The moment the door opened, a bell above it gave a small, defeated jingle, but inside, no one flinched except for Jake, the young bartender. At 22, Jake was all lanky limbs and nervous energy, his hair a mop of brown curls, his uniform a starched white shirt that he kept nervously adjusting. His eyes were wide with a mix of fear and defiance as he gripped a damp rag, his knuckles white. "They're here, Jim," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the thrum of the bikers' idling engines. Jim was the protagonist. He was a man of 42, his face etched with fine lines, his short beard a mix of dark brown and gray. His gray hair was cut short and neat. He wore a simple dark blue polo shirt and faded jeans that had seen better days. He was methodically polishing a pint glass, his movements precise and practiced. He didn't stop, didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge the arrival with a glance. His hands were steady, and his focus was absolute. as if the world outside the rim of the glass ceased to exist. He worked with an economy of motion, a quiet, almost meditative grace. He wasn't big or broad, not like the men entering the bar. He was wiry, with a posture that was ramrod straight but seemed to slouch in a way that made him appear smaller. "Let me handle this, Jim," Jake said, his voice a little stronger now, trying to take on a protector's role. Jim just gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture so subtle it could have been a twitch. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional clinking of ice in a glass as patrons pretended to be engrossed in their drinks. The Rust's leader, a man named Savage by the patch on his vest, scanned the room with a predator's gaze. He was a human mountain, his leather vest stretched tight over a massive chest. His arms, thick with tattoos of skulls and barbed wire, were crossed over his chest. His eyes were a startling, icy blue, and they held no warmth. His gaze settled on Jake first, sizing up the young man's fear, and then slid past him to Jim. Savage's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. Jim simply finished polishing the glass and placed it on the shelf, then reached for another. He still hadn't looked at the newcomers directly. The contrast between Jim's calm, almost invisible presence and the palpable menace of the gang filled the room. The bar was no longer a sanctuary, it was a stage. Jim, the unassuming cleaner, was about to be cast in a role he hadn't asked for. His gaze, finally lifting from his task, settled on the man at the front of the pack. The silent standoff was over, and the play was about to begin. Savage, the leader of the Rust, was a walking monument to intimidation. He stood a full 6.5 feet tall, a human mountain of muscle and scarred skin. His shaved head was a roadmap of faded ink, and his face was a mosaic of scowling defiance, framed by a short, bristly goatee. A tattered, sleeveless denim vest revealed arms that were a gallery of angry, coiled snakes and demonic faces, a visual diary of violence. But it was his eyes that held the true chill, two chips of glacial blue that scanned the room not for people, but for threats and weaknesses. The rest of his gang, all 5 of them, didn't move randomly. They fanned out with a practiced ease, not unlike a military patrol. One took a position by the door, his hands in his pockets, but his eyes tracking every movement. Another leaned against the wall near the restrooms, a perfect spot to observe the back of the room. A third walked slowly toward the jukebox, blocking the path to the side exit. Jim, still calmly wiping down his bar, noted the formation in an instant. It was a classic shatter formation, designed to isolate and intimidate, to break up group resistance and assert dominance. They weren't just a bunch of thugs. They were a unit. They had discipline, albeit for a dark purpose. Jim's internal analysis of the tactical spread was a silent, split-second assessment. It was a language he knew far too well, a grammar of controlled violence. The other patrons, including old Mr. Henderson, just saw a group of big, scary men. They didn't see the silent, coordinated movement of a hunting party. They didn't notice the way the men's eyes flickered to the various exits, mapping the room. But Jim did. He knew exactly what they were doing and why. Savage took a few heavy, deliberate steps toward the bar, his boots thudding on the wood floor. He stopped directly in front of Jim, his massive frame blotting out the light. He leaned forward slightly, placing his large hands flat on the bar, and smiled. A flash of yellowed teeth that was all threat, no warmth. "Evenin', folks," he boomed, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the high ceilings. "Just some friendly travelers looking for a place to rest our bones. And maybe a little conversation." His gaze never left Jim's. The words were a veneer of false politeness, a thin coating of sugar over a bitter pill. Everyone knew what he meant. He wasn't asking for a conversation, he was demanding a toll. The entire room fell silent, the spotlight now squarely on Jim, the man who was about to be asked to pay the price. Jim's calm presence was a quiet defiance, and Savage clearly wasn't used to defiance of any kind. He tilted his head, his gaze still fixed on Jim. "What's your name, bartender?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jim placed the clean glass on the rack, a soft, final clink in the thick silence. He met Savage's gaze with a neutral expression. "Just Jim," he replied, his voice a quiet, even baritone, completely lacking in fear or subservience. Savage chuckled, a hollow sound without humor. "Just Jim. I like that. A man of few words. He pushed a finger across the bar, dragging a small puddle of spilled water toward Jim. "We'll need 6 of your finest whiskeys. And make it quick. My boys are thirsty." As Jim turned to grab a bottle, one of the bikers, a younger, leaner man with a sneer on his face, slid from his position by the jukebox and sidled up to the bar. He was wearing a worn denim vest and a dirty white t-shirt. He reached out and let his hand brush against Jim's hip as he passed, a deliberate, unwanted touch. It was a small act, a test of boundaries. Jim didn't flinch. His body, in a motion too quick and fluid to be intentional, shifted slightly. The hand, meant to make contact, found only air. It was a deflection so smooth and natural that the biker, surprised, stumbled a half step. The move was so subtle that most people, including the biker himself, would write it off as an awkward accident. From the other end of the bar, Jake saw the move and bristled. "Hey, watch it, man," he snapped, stepping forward, his hands balled into fists. But before he could get a second word out, Jim put a hand up, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It was enough. Jake's mouth clamped shut, his anger warring with his ingrained respect for Jim's quiet authority. Jim gave Jake a subtle shake of the head, a silent warning to stand down. Jim turned back to the bar, his movements still calm and professional. He placed 6 glasses on the counter and began to pour. Savage watched him with a new light in his eyes. The casual act of aggression had not gotten the reaction he expected. Instead of fear or anger, he had seen something else, a practiced, almost automatic defense. He hadn't seen Jim's face-change expression, hadn't heard a single word of protest. He had only seen the almost effortless, physical avoidance of the touch. Savage leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're an interesting one, just Jim," he said. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a calculating look. This was no longer a simple shakedown. This was personal. He saw a man who wasn't afraid, and he couldn't stand it. He was intrigued, and a predator's intrigue is a dangerous thing. Jim finished pouring the 6 whiskeys, the liquid glowing amber under the bar's warm light. He slid them across the worn wooden surface, the glasses making soft, rhythmic thuds as they came to a stop in front of each biker. He then leaned forward, his hands resting on the counter. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice still low and steady. Savage didn't touch his glass. His eyes, fixed on Jim, held a hard, predatory glint. "That's good for now, just Jim," he said, the name a mocking drawl. "But we have a different kind of business to discuss. A partnership." He gestured around the quiet bar with a sweep of his hand. "This is a nice little place you got here. A shame if something were to happen to it." Jake, from his spot behind the counter, gripped the rag even tighter, his knuckles white. The words were a thinly veiled threat, a textbook shakedown. Jim, however, didn't react. He reached for a fresh rag and began to wipe a small spill on the counter with slow, methodical strokes. The contrast was almost comical. A man in a quiet polo shirt cleaning a counter while a giant in a leather vest laid down a law of extortion. Savage watched Jim's unwavering focus on the spill, his jaw tightening. He expected fear, a stammered plea, anything but this quiet, professional calm. "So, let's get down to business," Savage continued, his voice hardening. "My club, the Rust, offers protection. For a small fee, of course. $1,000 a week. Keeps the accidents away." He pulled a lighter from his pocket and flicked it open and shut, the sound a sharp click-click that punctuated his words. The small flame danced for a moment, an obvious reference to the last bar in the next county that mysteriously burned to the ground after refusing their protection. Jim finally stopped wiping, but he still didn't look up. He met Savage's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm and polite. "I don't have the authority to make a deal like that. The owner is away on vacation. I just work here." The words were a simple truth, but to Savage, they were a rejection, a quiet act of defiance. The politeness of the refusal only served to infuriate the large biker. It was a refusal without a challenge, a dismissal without a fight. Savage's face darkened, the muscles in his jaw clenching. He slammed his hand on the counter, rattling the glasses, and the simple act of wiping down the bar became an act of war. Savage's face was a mask of simmering rage. "Just work here," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous, each word a hammer blow. He shoved his face close to Jim's, invading his personal space, the reactionary gap that any trained individual instinctively protects. But Jim held his ground, his expression a calm, unreadable mask. The simple act of Jim's continued composure was an insult to Savage's authority. He was not being feared, and that was unacceptable. Savage gestured to his crew with a subtle flick of his chin. The men began to move with a practiced, predatory grace. The one by the door took a step to his right, blocking the main exit with his broad frame. The man by the jukebox shifted, his gaze locking onto Jake, making the young man freeze. The three others moved in, forming a crescent around the back of the bar, cutting off any path to the storage room or back door. It was an encirclement, a classic tactical maneuver. The target was isolated, all escape routes were sealed, and the pressure was on. Jim's mind, in a flash of military discipline, silently cataloged the positions. Encirclement, he thought, the word a cold, clinical label for the situation. He noted the man by the door was leaning slightly on his left leg, a hint of an old injury. The man by the jukebox was distracted, his eyes on the frightened patrons. He was not a dedicated sentry. The three men in the back were too close together, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. They were thugs, not soldiers. Jim's assessment was a silent, internal monologue, a survival mechanism honed over decades. It was a language the rest of the bar could not understand. His fingers, still on the rag, brushed against a small, worn object tucked into his jeans pocket, a silver dog tag, its chain of familiar, comforting weight. It was a ritual, a silent anchor to a past he had worked so hard to bury. He had carried it with him for years, a small piece of a history he had tried to leave behind. He hadn't touched it in months, not since he had found peace in this quiet, unassuming bar. But now, in the silent moment of encirclement, the familiar feel of the cold metal against his skin grounded him. It was a reminder of who he was, and what he was capable of. Savage, seeing no change in Jim's demeanor, grew more agitated. He reached out and grabbed a half-empty bottle of whiskey from the bar, wrapping his massive hand around its neck. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he snarled, his voice a low growl. The bottle was a silent threat, a physical object meant to break Jim's calm. This was the moment of no return. Savage had crossed the final line, moving from psychological pressure to imminent physical violence. The game was over. The violence was no longer a threat, it was a promise. As Savage tightened his grip on the whiskey bottle, a voice cut through the thick tension. "Let him go, you big idiot." It was Mr. Henderson, the old man who had been smoking his pipe in the corner. He stood slowly, his thin frame belying his steely resolve. He was wearing a worn flannel shirt and old denim overalls, a picture of a decent, ordinary man pushed to his breaking point. He took a couple of shuffling steps forward, his hand clenching an empty glass, a laughable weapon against the armed thugs. Savage turned his glacial blue eyes toward the old man, a look of pure, amused contempt on his face. He let out a low, guttural laugh. "Well, look at that. The grandpa wants to play hero. Go back to your corner, old man, before you get hurt." The men in his crew echoed his laughter, a harsh, ugly sound that filled the bar. Mr. Henderson ignored the taunts. "This isn't your town, and he's not your punching bag," he said, his voice trembling slightly, but his gaze holding steady. "We're just simple folks here. We don't want any trouble." The words were a quiet plea, a desperate attempt to appeal to a common decency that Savage clearly lacked. The tension was a tangible thing, a coil wound tighter and tighter. From the other side of the room, two more patrons stood up. One was a young mechanic in a greasy jumpsuit, the other a burly farmer with a red bandana tied around his neck. They were outmatched and outgunned, but they were ready to stand with their community. The entire bar was on a knife's edge, a small, quiet town ready to fight a battle it couldn't win. They were a flock of sheep, bravely preparing to face down a pack of wolves. Jim, who had been completely still during this exchange, finally moved. He took a subtle step forward, placing himself between Mr. Henderson and Savage. "It's okay, Mr. Henderson," he said softly, his voice a calm bomb in the storm. They were just leaving. The words were a polite dismissal, an attempt to defuse the situation, but they were also a silent signal to Savage. The target was no longer the patrons. The danger, and the focus, was squarely back on him. Jim was giving his friends an out. placing the burden of the confrontation entirely on his own shoulders. He was alone again, facing down the pack. Savage's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound, completely devoid of humor. "Leaving?" he snarled, his eyes wide with a manic fury. He slammed the whiskey bottle onto the bar, the glass bottom striking the wood with a jarring crack that made everyone jump. "We're not going anywhere until you learn some respect, old man." The words were no longer about money or a simple shakedown. They were about control, about power, about forcing this calm, unassuming man to break. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? Standing up to me like that? You're a fool in a cheap shirt." He reached out, his hand like a vice, and grabbed the front of Jim's dark blue polo. He didn't just grab it. He twisted the fabric, bunching it in his fist with a brutal force that should have pulled Jim off his feet. But Jim held his ground, his body a solid, unyielding mass. He didn't try to pull away, didn't fight back, simply absorbed the force. This passive, unbreakable resistance infuriated Savage further. He yanked harder, a violent, tearing motion meant to physically and psychologically dominate the man. The flimsy cotton shirt, old and worn from countless washes, couldn't hold up to the raw strength. The sound was distinct and final that echoed in the silent bar. It wasn't the sound of a simple tear. It was the sound of something breaking, something final and irrevocable. The sound hung in the air for a moment, a loud, brutal proclamation in a place built for quiet conversation. The flimsy fabric tore from the collar down to the chest, exposing the left side of Jim's torso. The tear was jagged and raw, a wound in the fabric of the man's quiet life. Jim stumbled back a step, but his face remained a mask of stone. He didn't try to cover himself. He didn't react with fear or rage. He simply stood there, his ripped shirt hanging uselessly from his shoulders, a tattered banner of his now exposed identity. The entire room went utterly still. Savage, who had been poised to deliver a verbal punchline, froze, his smug grin dissolving. The rest of the gang, who had been sneering in amusement, went silent. Every eye in the place, Mr. Henderson, Jake, the young mechanic, the farmer, all of them collectively held their breath. They were all looking at the same thing on Jim's chest, a single, stark image that was now, for the first time in years, visible to the world. The silence was absolute, a stunned, collective gasp without sound, a moment of dawning comprehension as they all saw what was exposed. The silence was so profound you could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning unit. Every eye in the rusty spoke was fixated on the exposed skin of Jim's chest, on the stark black tattoo that told a story louder than any words. It was a simple, yet powerful image, a winged dagger, an ancient symbol of silent, precise death. Below it, in crisp, block lettering that showed no sign of age or fading, were the words, "De oppresso liber." Below the words was a smaller, more discreet symbol, a small, delta-shaped arrow with a lightning bolt bisecting it. The tattoo wasn't a casual piece of art. It was an earned mark, a brand of belonging to one of the most elite, secretive, and lethal military units in the history of the world, Delta Force. The Greek phrase, "De oppresso liber," meaning to liberate the oppressed, was their motto. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a certificate of lethal expertise and a history of impossible missions. The image itself spoke a language of its own, a visual shorthand for a life of intense training, absolute discipline, and a willingness to operate in the darkest corners of the world. But the tattoo wasn't the only thing on Jim's body that told a story. Just below the ink, a thin, white scar snaked across his ribcage, the perfect width of a knife wound. On his shoulder, a faint indentation marked the path of a bullet that had somehow passed through. On his forearm, a series of tiny pockmarks suggested a run-in with shrapnel. His body wasn't a canvas of art. It was a roadmap of a brutal, unseen war. These were not scars from bar fights. They were the quiet trophies of a life spent in the shadows, fighting battles no one would ever know about. They were a testament to a man who had not only faced death, but had walked through it and come out on the other side. The gasps from the patrons were replaced by a stunned, respectful stillness. They hadn't seen a bartender. They had seen a man in a costume. Now, the costume was torn, and the true identity was revealed. Mr. Henderson, his trembling hands falling to his sides, was the first to give voice to the unspoken truth. "Delta," He whispered, his voice full of a sudden, awe-filled reverence. Delta Force. The words hung in the air, a final confirmation. The air in the bar shifted from fear to something else entirely, reverence. The silent, humble man who had been a target of humiliation was, in fact, a legend. Savage, for the first time, looked truly afraid. The whispered name hung in the air, a word of power that shattered Savage's bravado. His smug grin dissolved completely, replaced by a look of sheer, gut-wrenching terror. He instinctively took a step back, his eyes darting from the tattoo back to Jim's face, searching for some sign of the calm, polite bartender he had just tried to break. He found nothing. The man who had been a quiet servant was gone. In his place stood a sentinel. Jim's posture straightened, his shoulders squaring, his spine becoming ramrod straight in a way that had nothing to do with conscious effort and everything to do with a deep, ingrained muscle memory. His chin lifted slightly, and the quiet, almost subservient look in his eyes was replaced by a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to miss nothing. The warmth that had been in his face was extinguished, replaced by a steely focus, the kind of stillness that precedes a sudden, violent action. He was a professional, and his true self, for the first time in a decade, was on full display. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of his shoe on the floor was the only thing that broke the silence. He didn't speak with his old voice, the soft, low one of a man who served coffee. His new voice was clear, sharp, and carried with it a tone of command that cut through the air like a blade. "Michael," he said, the name a casual pronouncement that stunned Savage to the core. "Your name is Michael. You were discharged from the Marine Corps, 2nd Marine Division, dishonorable discharge, for aggravated assault. You've got a pending warrant in 2 states and a tattoo on your back of a cobra eating a bird, a common symbol among outlaw gangs. I've known who you were since you walked in the door." Savage's face went pale. The information was too specific, too personal. It wasn't a guess. Jim had seen him and already cataloged him, assessed him, and filed him away as a low-level threat. It was a silent threat, a demonstration of a level of awareness and intelligence that Savage couldn't even comprehend. Jim took another step, his presence filling the space. He wasn't a big man, but his stillness and focus made him the single most dangerous person in the room. He pointed a finger at the ripped fabric of his shirt. "I believe," he said, his voice as cold as ice, "you owe me an apology. Not for what you did, but for the disrespect of my property." The demand was so simple, yet so disarming. It wasn't about a fight. It was about the restoration of order, a final, unassailable demonstration of control. The hunter was now the hunted, and the whole bar was watching. Savage stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The revelation of his real name and his sordid past was a psychological hammer blow. But before he could stammer a reply, a new voice cut through the stunned silence. A patron from a corner booth, an elderly gentleman with a distinguished, white-haired haircut and a tailored sport coat, stood up, his face a mask of profound recognition. "Sergeant Major Thomas, sir," the man said, his voice trembling with an old soldier's deference. The use of rank, the formal address, was like a lightning bolt in the stillness of the bar. Jim's head turned slightly, a flicker of something close to surprise crossing his face, a momentary crack in his hardened veneer. The elderly gentleman looked around the room, addressing everyone. "I know this man," he announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had earned his place. "I was a captain with the 10th Mountain Division. During the Battle of Tora Bora, in Afghanistan, we were pinned down, out of ammo, with a company of men and no way out. We called in a ghost. We called in a ghost and prayed to God they were still alive." He paused, his gaze fixed on Jim. "We called in a ghost, and he came." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a legend. He pointed to a faint, perfectly circular scar on Jim's upper arm, a small, pale circle that could have been a birthmark to an untrained eye. "That, right there, is from a Soviet sniper round. He took a bullet for a translator who had intel that saved our entire platoon. The sniper never got a second shot off." From the bar, the young mechanic, his face suddenly full of understanding, spoke up. "My grandfather was in the CIA. He told me about a guy, an operator who was dropped behind enemy lines in Syria. They called him the Gray Ghost. He had a beard, was maybe 40, said he carried a piece of a compass. Said he disappeared for months at a time. Said he could walk into a place and know where everyone was and how to get out. The weight of these stories, one after the other, settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The protagonist, the quiet bartender, was not just a veteran. He was a whisper, a legend, a man of myth. Jim, for his part, simply stood there, silent and still, the torn polo shirt a strange testament to his past. He finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost sad. "Those were good men," he said, not denying their stories but deflecting the praise to their fallen comrades. Just doing their job. The simple words, a humble tribute to a shared history of sacrifice, were more powerful than any boast. The silence of the bar was now one of profound respect. The narrative of the humble bartender was now one of a quiet hero, and everyone in the room knew it. The legend confirmed. The silence in the bar became heavy with unspoken awe. Savage, his face a mask of utter defeat and shame, finally found his voice. "We're leaving," he stammered, the words hollow and weak. He turned to his men, a group of frightened bullies who had just seen their alpha male brought to his knees by a man in a ripped shirt. "Let's go." Now, they began to back away toward the door, their swagger completely gone. Their tactical formation had disintegrated into a panicked, uncoordinated retreat. The man by the door, the one with the bad leg, limped awkwardly backward, bumping into the jukebox guy. Their escape was uncoordinated and frantic, a stark contrast to their practiced, disciplined entry. They were a pack of hunters that had suddenly become the hunted. But as they reached the entrance, their path was blocked. Mr. Henderson, the old man who had bravely stood up to Savage, had repositioned himself. He was no longer just a feeble old man. He was a gatekeeper, his posture as straight as an iron rod. The mechanic, the farmer, and a couple of other patrons now stood with him, a unified front. They were no longer a collection of fearful civilians. They were a community, and they were closing ranks. "Leaving so soon," Mr. Henderson said, his voice quiet but firm, a stark contrast to his earlier trembling. "You haven't apologized yet, and you've got a lot of things to apologize for." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a unified front. The bikers were now trapped between the quiet legend in front of them and the solid wall of their victims behind them. The escape was denied. The room, which had been theirs to control, was no longer. Savage, a man used to being a predator, was now the prey. The look on his face, a raw mixture of fear and humiliation, was a perfect picture of a man who had made a fatal mistake. He was trapped in the very bar he had intended to conquer, and there was no way out. The humiliation was complete, and the stage was set for the final reckoning. The space between Jim and Savage was now a chasm of power. Jim took a single, slow, deliberate step forward, and Savage flinched, instinctively recoiling as if struck. The bar was silent, every eye fixed on the confrontation. A silent judgment passed on the man who had torn the shirt of a hero. Jim's gaze was cold, empty of malice, but full of a terrifying authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a sound. His presence alone was the new law of the land. "You came in here," Jim began, his voice a low, hard rumble, "and you brought your violence. You threatened good people. You tried to take what wasn't yours, and you thought you could do it because you're big and you wear leather." He took another step, the space between them shrinking. "I've seen true violence. I've seen men who do unspeakable things for a cause they believe in. You're not them. You're just a bully." His words, simple and direct, stripped Savage of all his power and posturing. Savage wasn't a warrior. He was a small-time thug, and Jim's words exposed his pathetic reality for all to see. He had pretended to be a wolf, but in the presence of a true sentinel, he was revealed to be a mere yapping dog. Jim stopped a foot away from Savage, his gaze holding the biker's terrified eyes. "I've been on patrol in places where every shadow holds a gun. I've been in rooms where the only law was the one I brought. And in this room, you have broken the law. And now, you will follow my command." He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply issued a command. His voice dropped to a whisper, but it was a whisper that carried the force of an unbendable will. "Kneel." The word was so simple, so unexpected, that Savage obeyed without thinking. The ingrained habit of obedience to a higher authority, even one he didn't understand, took over. His knees buckled, and he fell to the dusty floor, his head bowed in a posture of utter submission. He was no longer a feared leader. He was an animal, beaten and broken. He was on his knees, and the entire room was watching his total surrender. The humiliation was complete. With Savage kneeling on the floor, stripped of his power and dignity, Jim's voice remained cold and clear, without a hint of mercy or malice. "The cost of your mistake is not going to be money," he said, his gaze sweeping over the other members of the gang, who were frozen in a state of fear and disbelief. "It's going to be something you've never had to pay before." His eyes, normally so kind, were now like chips of granite. "This is a good place. The people here are good. They don't deserve the likes of you. You will remember that." He spoke slowly, dictating the new terms. "This bar is now off limits. Not just this bar. This entire county. If I see any of you within a 50-mile radius of this place, there will be a reckoning. You will be found, and you will be dealt with. And it will not be pleasant." He paused, letting the cold, hard words sink in. "I've spent years living a quiet life. You chose to disturb that peace. Now you will learn what it means to face a man who is finished with running." He then turned his gaze back to Savage. "You will stand up, and you will apologize to everyone in this room. You will apologize for every person you've ever bullied, for every ounce of fear you've ever spread. And you will mean it." Savage, trembling, forced himself to his feet. He faced the patrons of the Rusty Spoke, his eyes downcast, unable to meet their gaze. I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice a broken whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." The words were hollow, but his shame was real, a visible weight on his shoulders. The air, which had been thick with fear and anger, was now filled with a quiet sense of justice. Jim watched him, and then, with a simple nod, gave the order to leave. "Now," he said, and the single word had the force of a storm. As Savage and his men shambled out the door, a defeated, broken crew, Savage paused and turned back, a final, lingering question in his eyes. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why were you hiding?" Jim stood in the doorway, the cool evening air washing over his face and the tattoo on his chest. He looked at the retreating figures of the bikers, now just a few quiet silhouettes shrinking into the distance. "I wasn't hiding," he said, his voice a low, final pronouncement that carried the full weight of a life lived in anonymity. "I was trying to live. Real warriors don't need to advertise what they are. We don't have to break things to prove we're strong. We don't have to terrorize people to feel powerful." He looked back into the bar at the faces of the patrons, the people he had worked with for years, and a flicker of a sad smile crossed his face. "I've seen the worst of humanity," he continued, his voice softer now, almost a personal confession. "And after all of it, all I wanted was to see the best of it, to work in a place where I could just be a man, to pour coffee and listen to people's stories without having to look for the enemy in every shadow. You didn't just disturb the peace, Michael. You took away a life I had worked hard to build." The words weren't said with anger, but with a quiet, profound sense of loss, a simple statement of fact that stung more than any shout could have. The bikers reached their choppers, the thunder of their engines now a timid whisper as they started them up. They didn't roar out of the parking lot as they had arrived. Instead, they rode away in a single file line, their headlights a timid procession fading into the night. Their departure was a stark contrast to their thunderous arrival, a testament to the fact that they had been humbled and broken by a man who had never even raised his voice. The threat was gone, replaced by a quiet, shame-filled retreat. A shared silence and relief settled over the room as the sound of the bikes disappeared entirely. Mr. Henderson, the young bartender Jake, and the other patrons simply stood there, watching the dust settle, a new and profound respect for the man behind the bar etched onto their faces. Jim turned away from the door and walked back to the bar, picking up a clean towel. He began to wipe down the counter, the simple, rhythmic motion a return to the quiet life they all knew. But everything had changed. The air in the Rusty Spoke was different now. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, reverent awe. The patrons, who had been frozen in place, began to move again, but with a new respect for their surroundings. Jake, the young bartender, walked over to Jim, his face a mix of shock and confusion. "Jim," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. I thought you were just, the guy who works here." Jim continued to wipe the counter, his movements still methodical. He finally looked at Jake, his eyes holding a depth that the young man had never seen before. "I am just the guy who works here," Jim said, his voice soft. "But that's all I wanted to be. After what I've seen, the things I've had to do, it was a relief to just be a man in a quiet town. A bartender. To have a life where my biggest problem was running out of ice." He gestured to the bar around them. "This place," he said, "is my peace. The nightmares don't find you when you're cleaning up after a shift. The ghosts stay quiet when you're pouring a drink for a friend." He pulled a small, tarnished compass from his pocket, a symbolic item he had carried for years, a reminder of the many places he had been lost. He placed it gently on the counter. "I wanted to be a man who didn't need to carry this anymore." Mr. Henderson approached, his face full of a deep sympathy. "We're sorry we didn't know," he said. "Sorry for not seeing." Jim shook his head. "It was the entire point. Not knowing was the only way I could live. You all saw a man, not a soldier. That was the greatest gift you could have given me." He picked up the compass, its worn metal warm in his hand. He looked at the torn shirt, at the tattoo that was no longer a secret. "But you know now," he said, a sigh escaping his lips. "And I have to be who I am." He looked at the patrons, his eyes filled with a new, quiet determination. "So no, I don't regret what happened tonight. It means I don't have to hide anymore." The silence that followed Jim's words was a moment of profound understanding. The patrons of the Rusty Spoke didn't just see a hero. They saw a man who had been through hell and simply wanted to be human again. And now, he had accepted that he was both. He had stopped hiding from his past and was ready to integrate it into his present. As if on cue, a young man who had been sitting in the corner, a new face in town, a veteran himself with a quiet, thousand-yard stare, approached the bar. His name was Ben, and he was in his mid-20s. He had been listening to everything, and for the first time since he had been home from a deployment, his eyes held a flicker of hope. He was wearing a simple gray sweatshirt and faded cargo pants. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and his shoulders were slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller. "My name is Ben," he said, his voice soft, almost inaudible. "I was in the 82nd Airborne. I can't sleep. The dreams, they won't stop." He looked at Jim, his eyes pleading for understanding. "How do you do it? How do you just exist?" The question was a raw, honest plea from one soldier to another. Jim looked at the young man, a fellow traveler on the same difficult road. He placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple, comforting gesture. "You don't exist, Ben," he said. "You live. You take the things you learned, and you find a new purpose for them. The vigilance, the attention to detail, the willingness to defend the innocent, those aren't just for a battlefield. They're for here, for this place." He gestured around the bar. "This is our new post, our new mission. We don't have to fight a war to be a warrior. We can be a shield. We can make this a place where people like us can come and just be, where we don't have to explain, where we can just have a beer or a cup of coffee and a conversation." Jim's face, for the first time, held a light of purpose he hadn't had before. He was no longer running from his past. He was integrating it, using it to build something new. He was becoming a leader, not in combat, but in healing. He picked up the coffee pot and poured a cup, handing it to Ben. The young veteran took it, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes meeting Jim's with a new kind of respect. Jim was no longer just the bar's protector. He was becoming its guardian, its anchor. And with a simple cup of coffee, he had just welcomed a new soldier to the new mission. The weeks that followed were a testament to the power of a single moment of truth. The Rusty Spoke wasn't just a bar anymore. It was a sanctuary. Its reputation, whispered from person to person, spread through the community and beyond. The clientele began to change. More and more veterans, young and old, found their way to the bar. They came not for the beer, but for the quiet, understanding presence of the man behind the counter. For the first time, they felt like they could finally relax and simply be. Physical changes began to appear. Mr. Henderson, the old man who had started the pushback, brought in an old, faded photograph of his unit from the Korean War and hung it on a wall near the dartboard. Ben, the young paratrooper, donated a small, tarnished paratrooper's badge, placing it in a shadow box behind the bar. Other veterans followed suit, and soon the walls were a silent gallery of military memorabilia, medals, old photos, and worn patches. The owner, a man named Frank who had been away, returned and was stunned by the transformation. He didn't question it. Instead, he brought in a flag with an embroidered eagle, a symbol of honor, and placed it proudly behind the counter. New traditions were born. A Veterans Night on Tuesdays brought a new kind of camaraderie to the bar. The chatter wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a quiet, shared understanding. Laughter was a little more genuine, and the silence held a different kind of respect. The men in the bar found a common language, a silent understanding that only came from shared sacrifice. They were no longer just patrons and a bartender. They were a community built on trust and a deep sense of belonging. One evening, Jim stood alone, the last to leave. He pulled a small box from beneath the counter. Inside was a silver star, a medal for valor he had earned long ago but had never shown to anyone. He had kept it in a closet for years, a reminder of a past he had tried to outrun. But now, it felt different. It was no longer a burden of his past, but a symbol of his identity. He took a nail and a hammer from a drawer and, with a few quiet taps, hung the medal on the wall next to the flag, a final, public acceptance of who he was. The Sentinel had found his place, and he was no longer a ghost in a new town. The change wasn't just in the bar's decor or clientele. It was in the people themselves. A few months after the incident, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Jake, the young bartender, approached Jim with a serious look on his face. He was wearing his usual starched white shirt, but his posture was straighter now, his gaze more direct. The nervous energy he once carried had been replaced by a quiet resolve. "Jim," he said, his voice hesitant but firm. "Can I ask you something?" Jim nodded, his eyes kind. "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding a new purpose. My whole life, I just wanted to pour beers and have a quiet life, like you. But after that night, I feel like I should be doing more." He took a deep breath. "I went to the recruiter's office this morning. I'm thinking of enlisting." The words hung in the air, a profound admission. Jim's face remained calm, but a shadow of concern passed over his eyes. He put a hand on Jake's shoulder, a gesture of quiet support. "Jake," he said, his voice low and serious. "The military isn't a movie. It's a hard life. You'll see things. You'll carry them with you for a long, long time." He paused, his gaze meeting Jake's. "Do you want to do it because you think it's a way to be a hero, or because you believe in something more than yourself?" The question was a test, a way to gauge the sincerity of the young man's conviction. Jake didn't hesitate. "I believe in protecting the good places, Jim. The quiet ones. Like this place. I want to be someone who stands between the bullies and the good people. Like you." The answer was simple, but it was honest. It was born of a newfound understanding of what it meant to serve, to stand up for something bigger than yourself. Jim nodded slowly. "Then you'll be a good soldier. But remember this. You don't find peace by running from the bad things you see. You find it by creating the good things you want to see. Don't be a hero for anyone else. Be a good man for yourself." He was not only mentoring a young man, but he was also articulating the very creed that had shaped his own life and brought him to this moment of clarity. Jake looked at him, his face filled with newfound purpose. "Was it worth it, Jim?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. "All the sacrifice, the pain, was it worth it?" Jim's answer was quiet, simple, but it carried the weight of a life lived for others, a life that was now finally at peace. It was late, a few months later. The lights of the Rusty Spoke were low, and a soft rain pattered against the windows. Jim was the last one there, cleaning up. The bar was in perfect order. The glasses shone, the floors were swept, and the chairs were stacked neatly on the tables. The walls, now a silent testament to a hidden history of service, were a testament to the new soul of the place. He was still the bartender, but now he was something more. He paused for a moment, catching his reflection in the dark glass of the liquor cabinet. He saw a man with gray in his beard and wisdom in his eyes. He no longer saw the frightened young recruit he once was, or the broken veteran who had sought to bury himself in a quiet life. He saw a man who had faced his demons and had chosen to stand his ground. He saw the Sentinel. He saw the Guardian. He reached for a worn rag and continued to wipe down the counter, the rhythmic motion a comforting ritual. His internal monologue was a quiet echo of his newfound purpose. Still serving, still protecting, still faithful. The torn shirt was a distant memory, replaced by a deep sense of peace that had been absent for a long, long time. He finished his work and walked to the front door, switching off the lights. The bar, now a beacon of light and safety in the darkness, stood as a symbol of the quiet man who had found his mission by not running from his past. He locked the door, and in the reflection of the glass, a final, poignant image appeared. A man, a hero, a sentinel, standing watch. The rusty spoke was a sanctuary, and Jim was its quiet guardian. The world was at peace, and so, for the first time in a very long time, was he. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.